"You're a disgrace," my father screamed out for saying no to his plan. Then he kicked me out. I didn't say anything. I left quietly. But that kind of validation was a distant dream. Right now, the only reality was the stinging cold of the wind and the echo of the front door slamming behind me. The evening had begun with a suffocating formality. My father, Richard Jensen, had arranged the dinner with the precision of a military operation. The dining room table was set with the good china, the kind we were terrified to touch as children. Across from me sat the Cole family. In our town, the Coles owned the factories that kept the lights on. They were powerful, rich, and notoriously difficult. Tonight, however, they were smiling. Mr. Cole cut his steak with surgical, deliberate motions. His daughter Vanessa sat next to him. We went to the same high school, but we moved in different orbits. She looked bored, pushing peas around her plate, while her father discussed market shares and supply chain integration. I kept my head down, eating quickly, hoping to be excused so I could finish my calculus homework. I had no idea that my future had already been printed on an agenda I was never meant to see. My father cleared his throat. It was a sound that demanded absolute silence. He began to speak about the importance of legacy. He talked about how families, like businesses, needed to merge to survive. I nodded, assuming this was another lecture on work ethic. Then, he shifted his gaze to me. It was not a look of pride. It was an appraisal. He spoke of the union between the Jensen and Cole families. He spoke of a summer wedding right after graduation. He spoke of how Vanessa and I would secure the future of both companies. The room spun. I looked at my mother. She was staring at the tablecloth, her hands gripping her napkin so tight her knuckles were white. She knew. She had known for weeks. I looked at Vanessa. She finally met my eyes, her expression a mix of pity and resignation. This was not a proposal. It was a transaction. I was not a person to them. I was currency. A cold clarity washed over me. All the pressure to get good grades, to dress well, to learn manners. It was not for my benefit. It was to increase my market value. I felt a wave of nausea, followed immediately by a surge of anger so hot it made my hands shake. I placed my fork down. The clatter rang out like a gunshot in the quiet room. I told him no. The conversation stopped. Mr. Cole froze with his glass halfway to his mouth. My father smiled a tight, dangerous expression that did not reach his eyes. He laughed it off, calling it teenage nerves. He tried to continue the pitch. I stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. I looked him in the eye and said it again. I told him I was not property. I told him I was not marrying Vanessa Cole for his stock portfolio. My father did not yell at first. He stood up slowly, his face draining of color. He apologized to the guests with a terrifying calmness. Then he walked over to me, grabbed me by the shoulder, and marched me toward the foyer. His grip was bruising. When we reached the hallway, the mask fell. His face contorted into pure, unadulterated rage. He told me I was ungrateful. He told me I was ruining the only chance this family had to survive the next decade. He pointed to the door. He gave me a simple choice. I could go back in there, sit down, and apologize, or I could leave. If I walked out that door, I was no longer his son. I was no longer a Jensen. I looked at the heavy oak door. It was the barrier between the life I knew and a void I could not comprehend. But looking back at the dining room, I saw something worse than the void. I saw a cage. I did not hesitate. I did not beg. I turned the brass handle and stepped out into the chill of the evening. The door slammed shut with a violence that shook the frame. I heard the lock click. It was the sound of a severance. I stood on the pavement, shivering in my dress shirt, listening to the silence of the suburban street. I was 17 years old. I had empty pockets. I had no home. And, for the first time in my life, I was free. The silence of the street was heavier than the shouting had been. It pressed against my eardrums, ringing with the finality of the lock clicking shut. The walk from the suburbs to the edge of the city took hours. My dress shoes, polished to a mirror shine for the dinner, offered no protection against the miles of asphalt. Every step sent a shock of pain up my shins, but I kept moving, because stopping meant acknowledging the reality of what had just happened. I had been erased. The life I thought was solid, the university acceptance letters, the summer plans, the bed with the down comforter, had all evaporated the moment the door clicked. I found a spot near a construction site where the wind was blocked by a stack of plywood. I sat on the cold ground, pulling my knees to my chest to conserve heat. My stomach growled, a hollow, cramping sensation that twisted deeper as the night wore on. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the image of the steak left uneaten on my plate. The hunger was sharp, but the cold was a dull, aching pressure that seeped into my bones. I did not sleep. I just waited for the sun to rise, watching the shadows lengthen and retreat, realizing that for the first time in 17 years, no one knew where I was, and no one was coming to look for me. By the second afternoon, the adrenaline had faded, replaced by a desperate, gnawing need for survival. I stood outside a convenience store, gripping my phone. I had 12% battery left. My thumb hovered over the contact list. I could call my mother. I could call my aunt. But every time I thought of them, I saw my father's face, smug and certain that I would come crawling back. I would rather freeze than prove him right. I scrolled past my family and hit the button for Jax. Jax was the kind of friend my father called a delinquent. He fixed cars in his driveway and smoked cigarettes behind the gym. When he answered, his voice was rough with sleep. I did not have the energy to lie. I told him I was out. I told him I had nowhere to go. The silence on the other end lasted only a second before he gave me his address. Walking into the apartment Jax rented was like stepping onto a different planet. It was small, cluttered with car parts and pizza boxes, and smelled of stale tobacco. But it was warm. He did not ask for details. He just pointed to a lumpy sofa in the corner and tossed me a blanket. The shame burned hotter than the cold outside. I was the rich kid, the one with the trust fund and the future. And here I was, begging for a spot on a couch that smelled like motor oil. I stayed for 2 days, just long enough to wash my shirt and eat enough instant noodles to stop the shaking. I knew I could not stay forever. I needed money. I walked to the industrial district, where the buildings were massive, gray blocks of concrete and steel. A sign taped to a chain link fence read simply, "Help wanted, immediate start." It was a distribution warehouse, a cavernous space filled with the roar of conveyor belts and the screech of forklifts. The air was thick with dust and the smell of diesel fumes. The shift supervisor, a man with a clipboard and eyes that looked like they had not closed in a week, hired me on the spot. He did not ask about my grades or my family tree. He looked at my shoulders, nodded, and handed me a pair of work gloves. The work was a physical assault. My job was to unload trucks, moving boxes that weighed 50 pounds or more onto a moving belt. Lift, pivot, drop. Lift, pivot, drop. For 10 hours straight. My hands blistered within the first hour. By the 4th hour, my back felt like it was on fire. By the end of the shift, I could not lift my arms above my shoulders. To survive, I learned to shut everything off. I went into what I called robot mode. I stopped thinking about the calculus test I was missing. I stopped thinking about the softness of my bed at home. I stopped thinking about my mother's silence. I focused entirely on the rhythm of the work. The box was the only reality. The belt was the only timeline. If I thought about anything else, the grief would cripple me, and I could not afford to be crippled. I needed the paycheck. When I finally held that first check, it was meager compared to the allowance I used to get. But staring at the paper strip, seeing my name printed next to a sum I had bled for, I felt a shift. My father had always told me that without him, I was nothing. He said I was a parasite, feeding off his success. Holding that money, I realized he was wrong. I was hungry, I was exhausted, and I was alone. But I was alive, and I had done it myself. I cashed the check at a liquor store and bought a sandwich that tasted better than any filet mignon I had ever eaten. I walked back to the warehouse for the night shift, the muscles in my legs screaming with every step. I was just a number on a payroll now, a pair of hands in a sea of boxes. But as I walked through the bay doors, I felt a strange resolve hardening inside me. I would survive this. I would build something from this rubble, brick by brick. The warehouse was chaos that night. The conveyor belts were jammed. Shouting echoed from the loading dock, and the air was thick with panic. I pulled on my gloves, stepping into the noise, unaware that the disorder around me was about to present an opportunity I never saw coming. The chaos in the warehouse was usually a steady, manageable hum. But that night, the noise shifted into a frantic, grinding roar. The primary conveyor belt, a mile-long rubber spine that carried 80% of the outgoing shipments, shuddered and slammed to a halt. The sudden silence of the machinery was instantly replaced by the shouting of floor supervisors and the panicked beeping of scanner guns. Red strobe lights began to flash along the ceiling. A bottleneck had formed at the central junction, and within seconds, hundreds of boxes were piling up against the blockage, crushing each other under the weight of the backlog. The shift manager, a man named Miller, who usually spent his nights hiding in the break room, was screaming at the line workers to manually pull packages off the belt. It was a futile order. They were trying to empty an ocean with a spoon. I stood at my station, watching the panic spread. My first instinct was to keep my head down and wait for instructions, to remain the invisible, obedient worker I had forced myself to become. But as I watched the packages crush against the metal guards, the analytical part of my brain, the part I had suppressed since leaving my father's house, snapped awake. I looked at the jam, but I did not see boxes. I saw a flow chart. I saw vectors and timing intervals. Slept. Miller was trying to clear the obstruction. But the problem was not the boxes. It was the feed rate coming from the upper mezzanine. The sensors were misreading the gap between pallets, sending freight down too fast for the lower belt to accept. If they kept clearing the jam without fixing the feed, the system would crash again in 30 seconds. I dropped the box I was holding. I did not ask for permission. I walked past my station, weaving through the confused crowd of workers. Miller saw me moving out of my zone. He shouted at me to get back on the line, his face turning a blotchy red. I ignored him. I climbed the metal stairs to the control gantry 2 steps at a time, my heavy boots clanging against the grating. When I reached the secondary control panel, I didn't hesitate. I keyed in the override sequence for the upstream feed, slashing the input speed by 40%. Then, I hit the divert switch, rerouting the overflow to the dormant lane 3. Below me, The crushing weight on the main belt stopped increasing. The diversion lane roared to life, siphoning off the excess pressure. I leaned over the rail and cupped my hands around my mouth. I yelled at the team on the floor to clear the central junction now that the pressure was off. They looked up, confused, but they moved. Within 2 minutes, the blockage was gone. I ramped the speed back up slowly, synchronizing it with the lower belt. The red lights stopped flashing. The steady, rhythmic hum of the facility returned. I stood on the gantry, my chest heaving, sweat dripping down my back. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a sudden dread. I had just abandoned my post and accessed a control panel without authorization. I expected Miller to fire me before I even reached the bottom of the stairs. But when I looked down, Miller wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the catwalk on the opposite side of the warehouse. Standing on the high observation deck was a woman I had never seen before. She was wearing a tailored charcoal suit that looked out of place among the grease and dust. She had her arms crossed, her posture rigid and attentive. She wasn't looking at the belt. She was looking directly at me. I walked down the stairs, bracing myself for the termination. I went back to my station and picked up my gloves, but before I could put them on, the floor supervisor tapped me on the shoulder. He didn't yell. Slept. He looked almost nervous. He told me the lady from corporate wanted to see me in the main office. The walk to the office felt longer than the walk out of my father's house. I prepared my defense. I was going to tell them I was just trying to help, that I knew the systems because I read the manual during my lunch breaks. I pushed open the glass door. The woman from the catwalk was sitting on the edge of the manager's desk. She was older than me, perhaps in her 40s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to dissect everything they landed on. Her name, I would learn later, was Monique Harris. She didn't offer me a seat. She asked me simply what I had done to the feed rate. I explained it. I told her about the sensor lag and the flow misalignment. I used the technical terms without thinking, describing the geometry of the bottleneck. I stopped when I realized I was rambling, reverting to the silence I had adopted for survival. Monique studied me for a long moment. She didn't ask about my education. She didn't ask why a 19-year-old box stacker knew how to reprogram a conveyor logic controller. She just nodded, as if confirming a suspicion. She told me that she was looking for a junior analyst for her logistics startup. She said she needed people who saw the whole board, not just the pieces. She told me the pay was entry level, the hours were brutal, and I would have to trade my work boots for a tie. It wasn't a handout. Her voice was cold, challenging. She was offering me a test. She wanted to see if the kid who fixed the belt was a fluke or a resource. I looked at my hands. They were raw, stained with dirt and grease. I thought of the cold apartment, the instant noodles, the constant fear of the next bill. Then I looked at Monique. In her expression, I saw something I hadn't seen since the dinner party, but this time it was different. It wasn't an appraisal of my obedience. It was a recognition of my competence. I told her I would take the job. She handed me a card with an address and a start time for the following Monday. As I walked out of the office, the roar of the warehouse seemed distant, like a storm moving away from me. I stepped out into the cool night air, and for the first time in 2 years, I didn't feel the weight of the world crushing me. I felt the terrifying, electric charge of a beginning. I had clawed my way out of the pit, not by using my father's name, but by using my own mind. I walked to the bus stop, clutching the business card in my pocket, like it was a winning lottery ticket. I didn't know it then, but I was done with survival. It was time to start building. Years later, the builder was gone. Only the operative remained. The reinforced steel door clicked shut and cut off the noise of the busy street. Elias stood alone in the center of the safe house and listened for footsteps. He moved quickly to the mahogany desk and dropped to his knees. His hands felt along the underside of the central drawer until he found the strip of tape. He peeled it back and the small brass key fell. In his palm he stood and jammed the key into the lock of the gray filing cabinet in the corner. The mechanism turned with a stiff grind. He yanked the top drawer open. It was empty. He checked the second and third drawers. Nothing but bare metal. He reached into the back of the bottom drawer, and his fingers brushed against a piece of paper. He pulled it out. It was a single index card with a date written in red ink. The date was yesterday. His stomach turned over as he realized he was 24 hours too late. The landline phone on the desk began to ring. The shrill ringing echoed against the bare walls of the safe house until Elias snatched the receiver from its cradle. He pressed the plastic against his ear and remained silent. "You are running behind schedule," a distorted voice said. Elias gripped the handset tight enough to whiten his knuckles. "Where are the files?" "The files are irrelevant now," the voice replied. "The date on the card is not a meeting. It is a deadline." The line went dead with a sharp click. Elias slammed the receiver down and shoved the index card into his leather jacket pocket. He scanned the room one last time to ensure he left no trace. He slipped out the door and descended the narrow staircase to the alleyway. The air outside was cold and smelled of damp pavement. He pulled his collar up and merged onto the sidewalk. A black sedan idled across the street, with its headlights off. The engine roared to life as the driver locked eyes with him. The tires squealed against the pavement as the sedan lunged forward. Elias turned and sprinted toward the narrow gap between two brick buildings. The car mounted the curb and smashed into the walls of the alley entrance with a sickening crunch of metal. Elias scrambled over a chain link fence at the end of the passage and dropped into a service road. He kept his head down and joined a stream of pedestrians heading into the subway station. He pushed through the turnstile and descended to the lower platform. The air down here was thick with the smell of ozone and old dust. He took the card out again and held it under the station lights. The red numbers were not a date after all. He recognized the sequence as a departure time and a carriage number. A pair of headlights cut through the tunnel darkness. The subway doors slid open with a pneumatic hiss. Elias stepped onto the train and navigated through the mass of commuters. He counted the cars until he reached the fourth carriage. The crowd thinned out here. He scanned the rows until he found the seat number matching the red ink on the card. A man in a tan trench coat sat alone. He watched Elias approach with calm detachment. Elias sat across from him and placed his hands on the table. "You cut it close," the man said. "I had company," Elias replied. "Tell me why I am here." The man pointed to the window. The tunnel walls were blurring past at an alarming speed. "The meeting was never about exchanging files," the man said. "It was about getting you on this train." Elias stood up, but the momentum of the car threw him back into his seat. The train was moving too fast. "We are not stopping," the man said. Elias looked at the emergency brake handle at the end of the car. A red light above the door began to flash. The red light pulsed and bathed the carriage in a warning glow. Elias realized the emergency brake was a decoy. "There is nowhere to go," the man said. He reached inside his trench coat. Elias did not wait to see the weapon. He kicked the bolted table with both heels and drove the metal edge into the stomach of his opponent. The man doubled over and gasped for air. Elias grabbed the heavy fire extinguisher from the wall bracket. He swung the canister against the safety glass of the subway door. The pane shattered and scattered across the floor. Wind roared into the car and deafened them both. The man raised a pistol with a shaking hand. Elias looked at the black blur of the tunnel outside. He took a breath and leaped into the darkness.